Greetings, everyone. I hope you all had a very, very happy Thanksgiving. As anyone who's listened to me and many who haven't, I view it as the world's greatest holiday. So I hope you all enjoyed that. And welcome to our spotlight session with Michèle Flournoy. I especially want to welcome some of the members of our distinguished advisory board who are joining us today, and members of our board of directors and many of our generous supporters. So thank you for being with us. I am Jim Hake. I'm the founder and CEO of Spirit of America. If you're not familiar with us, we are a citizen service organization, 501c3 nonprofit. We work alongside U.S. troops and diplomats all over the world to help them save and improve lives and represent the best of what America stands for. And right now we are especially active in Ukraine, Taiwan, Mozambique, and Iraqi Kurdistan. But today's conversation is with Michèle Flournoy. And we're really lucky and honored to have her. Michèle was a former Undersecretary of Policy at the Department of Defense, and especially near and dear to our hearts at Spirit of America, Michèle was also an entrepreneur. So she is a co-founder of the think tank Center for a New American Security and co-founder of West Exec Advisors. And unlike most who have served in government, Michèle has had to meet payroll. And, as we know, that's not as easy as it sounds sometimes. So Michèle was also a military spouse and a military mom. She is on the board of advisors at Spirit of America and been very generous with her time with us. And Michèle, thank you very much for being with us.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Jim.
So we have a lot of ground we'd like to cover in 30 minutes, but a housekeeping note for everyone who is tuned in with us. If you have a question, please submit that via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them. But Michèle, if you could start off with your take on, let's call it a state of the union with respect to national security. What are you worried about? What are you not worried about? And we'll take it from there.
Well, I think we are at an inflection point in our history. I think 20 years from now, we'll look back and recognize that the sort of tectonic plates of geostrategy were shifting. So we have kind of the closing, or not the closing, but the diminishment of an era that was defined by 9/11 and counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations. And that's in its stead the rise of really a new era of great power competition. Doesn't mean terrorism's going away, but it means that it's more in the background, and the threats that are really front and center are those being posed by a declining but revisionist power like Russia with its aggression against Ukraine, and a rising and much more powerful and aggressive China under Xi Jinping that is threatening a sort of might makes right approach to the Asia Pacific. At the same time, we have transnational challenges like, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. I'm sure it's not going to be the last pandemic we have to deal with, and certainly climate change, which challenge, our national security infrastructure in terms of coming up with coherent and effective responses. So very challenging time. And that's to say nothing of an Iran that's pursuing nuclear weapons, a North Korea that's nuclear saber rattling, and so forth. So many challenges on the horizon. At the same time, we have a period of profound technological disruption. So the technological cutting edge that has allowed the United States to maintain economic and military advantage for many decades is not something that's a given anymore. We have to compete to keep and extend that. And it comes at a time when we're all experiencing, sadly, a period of profound domestic political polarization, which means it's harder to bring the country together to make the necessary investments in the drivers of our competitiveness and in smart policy and legislation.
And with all of that, are there things you're optimistic about?
Yes, I am very optimistic about the next generation. One of the things I do to keep myself positive and excited about getting up out of bed in the morning in this very challenging world is work with young people. And the number and diversity of young people I see who want to serve their country in some way, formal or informal, who want to make a difference on climate change or national security or democracy. It's remarkable, and they're there, they're enthusiastic, they're passionate, they're talented, and I think that's what gives me hope about the future.
And you recently wrote about Taiwan and that there's not much time left for the United States to find ways to help defend Taiwan. And I want to speak with you a little bit more about that. But for starters, Taiwan is a small island. Let's call it an island nation. 25 million people or so. Why should Americans care about what happens to Taiwan?
Well, I think if Taiwan were taken by force, forced to reunify with China on China's terms because they were able to use political, economic, or military coercion to overwhelm Taiwan, that would define a rule, an order in Asia Pacific of a sort of might makes right. Great power gets to dictate terms to smaller states and powers, and that is not a good thing for a region where that will be probably have the greatest impact on the prosperity and security of Americans over the next half century. So I think we have a stake in the type of rules of the road that countries abide by to resolve disputes and differences. At the same time, we also have a huge economic interest. Taiwan is one of the major manufacturers of semiconductors, and I think there's been a Council on Economic Advisors report that assessed that if TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor chip manufacturer, if they were taken offline or somehow no longer trusted because of Chinese takeover, that it could have over $1 trillion of economic impact on the world globally. So we have both economic and strategic and values-based interests in what happens to Taiwan and its future.
And so an implication of what you just said is that if China were to take Taiwan by force, that kind of aggression or coercion would not likely end with Taiwan. Is that how you see it?
I think it would set up a dynamic where China would feel empowered to dictate terms to other smaller entities in the region. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think that's Xi Jinping's preferred plan. I think he would like to see Taiwan buckle under political and economic pressure and sort of give up its aspirations to govern itself as a democracy. But if that doesn't work, he's been very clear that he wants this issue resolved on his watch. It's a legacy issue for him, and he's instructed his military to be ready by 2027 to give him the option to take the island by force if necessary. So I think this is a critical window that we're in now for really strengthening deterrence and, as you mentioned, helping Taiwan strengthen its own ability to defend itself.
And one of the questions that has come in is China out to steal Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing capacity? Is that what it's about, or is it something larger than that?
I think China is out to steal advanced technology from any number of countries, and it's already stolen hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. technology. I think they have tried to infiltrate the Taiwanese economy where they can. And they would certainly like to take possession of Taiwan's semiconductor industry because their own, at this point, is generations behind.
And, in your piece, it was about time running out for the U.S. to help defend Taiwan and deter Chinese aggression. You indicated you thought the window was 2 to 5 years. And if you take the low end of that, 2 years, your piece was written about 2 months ago. So we're roughly 10%, the way toward that 2-year bottom line. How do you think America is doing in terms of following some of the recommendations that you made there?
Well, I think there is a growing sense of urgency in the Biden administration, in the Pentagon, on the Hill. But I think the bulk of US defense spending has been focused on capabilities, technologies that will become mature in the 2030s. And that's great. We want to make those investments. But what I was arguing is that if you're Xi Jinping, you spend the next 2 to 5 years trying the political and economic coercion, it doesn't work. And now you see the next 5 years, the US becoming much more strong in its posture and capabilities in the region, and you start worrying about your ability to deal with that, then there is a window where he would be incented to try a blockade or an invasion or whatever his plan is. And so that's the approach is we've got to bolster communication of our resolve, showing up in the region in all kinds of ways that we are here, we care, we will not accept unprovoked aggression against Taiwan, that we are investing in near-term capabilities that can meaningfully give Xi pause, make him question his ability to pull something like this off. Because you have to remember, this is a pretty risky proposition for him. If he tried to take Taiwan and was either thwarted or the costs were very, very great for China, which I think they would be, that could create his worst nightmare, which is domestic unrest and a loss of confidence in the Communist Party and its ability to govern. So we want to play on those concerns, those fears, those insecurity, and make him decide every day, today is not the day because I don't have the confidence that I can succeed. That's what deterrence is all about.
And if China were to take military action against Taiwan, what do you think the United States should do?
I think if that aggression is unprovoked, meaning it's not provoked by some unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan, for example, then I think the U.S. should, I think it's in our interests and it's consistent with our values to respond and seek to put together a coalition to try to defend Taiwan. But there's a time distance equation here. And Taiwan is very far away. It's an island. It's very close to China. And so the importance of them investing in their own defense and the capacity of their own population to resist is very important because they're going to have to buy time for the US and that international coalition to respond in numbers.
And you mentioned potential domestic unrest a moment ago. And we've seen domestic unrest in the last week or so with protests all over China. Do those protests surprise you? And where do you think they will lead?
I think I was surprised by the extent of the protests and the fact that the messaging from the protesters sort of went from, we don't like the COVID lockdown to really questioning Xi Jinping's, right to rule, if you will, in some cases. So that's pretty different than anything we've seen since Tiananmen Square. I think that Xi's in a tough box because he really, he's doubled down on COVID lockdowns again and again, the no COVID policy. If he were to walk away from that, he might risk, a level of infection and deaths that would overwhelm the medical infrastructure. So he's in a box. And it's also now impacting his economy in various serious ways. So he's got his hands full domestically right now. I think it's an open question where these protests go. I think normally the response is a very heavy-handed repression of the protesters. I think in this case, they worry about that actually fueling the protests and bringing more people out into the streets. So I think we have to watch this very closely to see where it goes. But I don't think we should underestimate the repressive instruments of the Chinese state. I mean, they're very severe, and I'm pretty sure this leadership would use them to the full extent if necessary to hold on to power.
Well, and that's what we're seeing in Russia as well, of course, and we'll get to that in a second. One of the interesting things that always seems to be the case is that authoritarians do what authoritarians do, and they overreach, even in ways that are silly, but ultimately grate the population. So, the COVID policy is a very serious one for people, of course, but they're now essentially setting up the ability to punish people for liking certain content on social media, just clicking the heart or what have you, as an expression of, as an anti-government expression, which is outlawed. So those kind of things seem to be just a natural part of that kind of a system. And where it goes is, I think, will be quite interesting.
I agree.
So with Russia, I'll ask you the same questions I did about Taiwan with respect to Ukraine. Why should Americans care about what happens in Ukraine?
Well, after the end of the Cold War, we really worked very hard to, realize the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And I think we all expected that to endure indefinitely. And what we've seen with Putin's unjustified aggression against Ukraine is a threat to that vision, and a threat that, war is coming back to Europe in a very 19th century and 20th century kind of way. And it's horrifying. It's offensive to our interests. It offends our values. And while Ukraine is not part of NATO, it is part of Europe, and it is on Europe's doorstep, as we've seen, just in how this has affected Poland and other frontline states with refugee flows and so forth. So I think Europe has to care. I've frankly been pleased at the way NATO very quickly came together, refound its purpose, overcame any internal differences, and has been incredibly solid in providing both military and economic and political support to Ukraine. I think Putin is doing everything he could think of to try to break the will of the Ukrainian people, but also the will of the Europeans, trying to create a cold, dark winter for them. I think instead what this is going to do is hasten the European energy transition, so they're no longer so dependent on Russia, but that'll take time. But I think, unfortunately, this is going to be a long, hard slog. Each side is hoping to break the will of the other. But I don't see either Ukraine. I certainly don't see Ukraine giving up anytime soon, and I don't see support for Ukraine diminishing fundamentally. And so, Putin at some point has to recognize that he doesn't have the wherewithal militarily to achieve his political objectives, and he's got to figure out how to put lipstick on a pig and find a way out of this, catastrophic invasion that certainly has not worked out the way he thought.
And what do you make of the calls for negotiations at this point in time?
I think it's too early. I think that until Putin really gets to that point where he realizes his objectives are unrealistic and he needs to find a way out so that he doesn't lose all credibility with his own people, it's not fruitful. There's no willingness on the part of Russia to negotiate. So I think it's too early. I wish both sides were ready, but they're not. And I think Ukraine will continue to press through the winter, and Russia's going to have a very hard time of it, given their constrained supply lines and the fact that a lot of their troops in Ukraine are not prepared for winter.
And with the threat of Putin's threats of use of nuclear weapons, what do you make of those?
Well, I don't think he's likely to actually make good on that threat unless he feels that his back is up against the wall and he's being, he has nothing to show with this invasion. Because if he has nothing to show for this invasion with 50,000 casualties on the Russian side, I mean, that's a threat to his ability to stay in power at home, potentially. And so that's the desperate sort of situation where I can envision him threatening or using nuclear weapons. I don't think we're anywhere near that at this point. I think what we have to make clear to Putin, we, the international community, is that if he were to cross the nuclear threshold, it would make things even worse for him in terms of sanctions and isolation and pressure for him to step down and so forth, and that, the global community would respond. And then frankly, I was very pleased to see one product of the Xi Biden meeting was, President Xi saying very clearly that he would not condone use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine conflict. That's a positive.
Right. And on a subject of protests in another country, and we're also somewhat related to Ukraine, We've seen the protests in Iran over the last month or so. Where do you think those might go? And is there, in your view, the possibility of regime change in Iran? And if so, what might come after?
You know, again, it's a great question, very hard to predict. What struck me about these protests is how they've morphed into something much more widespread than the original, kind of segment of the population that came out, and how persistent they've been. People are coming out day after day after day in cities across the country. And so I do think the regime has got to feel threatened. That said, this is an authoritarian regime with very strong instruments of state suppression, repression, willingness to do violence against its own citizens to keep control on power. And so you never know when, clearly there's tinder that, very dry tinder that could be ignited. But I think you'd need a spark. Some part of the elite in Iran would have to say, okay, enough. We need to make a change in the government in order to, avoid something worse. So I don't have, I'm not privy to the information to know whether any of that is happening. But I think it's really when you have protests from below and dissatisfaction among elites, at the top, that you have the potential for dramatic change. One absent the other, not so much.
And where do you think that stands in Russia today?
Well, I think for now, Putin has critics on both sides, but he also has remarkable continued support. So again, I'm not privy to the intelligence on it, but from what I'm reading in the newspaper, I'm not seeing the signs that any broad or widespread elite dissatisfaction at this point.
Yeah, and it's a tempting view, I think, to think that one person is the problem in a country like Russia. But how much of the problem that we're seeing expressed in the war and Russian aggression on Ukraine is leadership versus something deeper culturally or historically?
I mean, I think, Putin bears a lot of the blame here. He has promoted this sort of vision of regaining a Russian sphere of influence, recreating Russian kind of political dominion over many of the countries of the former Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. So there are aspects of this that are particular to Putin, but some of his critics on the right have absolutely bought into the vision and have been critical of him for not being effective enough in achieving it. So it's an open question of who would come after Putin and whether it would be same, worse, or better. I don't think it's necessarily someone who would be better. It would depend very much on who that person or that group would be.
And as we've seen, there's been an enormous, apart from the NATO allies in the United States, from a governmental standpoint, a tremendous civil society response inside Ukraine, and tremendous civil society response outside Ukraine to help the Ukrainians, both in terms of military support, humanitarian support, and so on, which has been enormously encouraging and important, of course. What do you most liken to that level of support historically? What is it, what happened in America after the attacks of 9/11? What's a good parallel to the mobilization of citizens and civilian organizations to help Ukraine?
I actually think it's reminded me a little bit about the aftermath of World War II and the refugee crisis, where I'm also, in addition to being on the advisory board of Spirit of America, I'm also on the board of CARE, and the term care package came from the boxes of assistance that Americans sent to refugees in Europe. And it was a great outpouring of the American people at the citizen level, very much the same support that Spirit of America taps into to enable, everyday Americans to give to people in need who were then, refugees in Europe, now refugees or displaced inside Ukraine. So there are some real parallels there, and it really does bring out the best of the kind of American generosity and American character. And so I've been, that's one of the reasons I've been such a big fan of Spirit of America. And I'm just going to remind everybody that it is Giving Tuesday. And so now is a good day. Today is a good day to go online to Spirit of America and click that donate button. And no, Jim Hake did not ask me to say that, but I'm just saying.
Well, thank you for the plug, Michelle. And on the the positive note of American generosity and the expression of goodwill that you were just talking about, since at least since 9/11, it seems that so much of U.S. national security and foreign policy has been driven by what we're against. Countering terrorism and countering extremism, countering Russian or Chinese influence or aggression. It's a pretty long list of things that it seems like we're against. And with the positive piece of what we're just talking about, it seems that what we're for has been missing in how our government approaches the world.
Yeah.
And you had a front row, it wasn't even a front row seat, it was on the court or on the playing field of defense policy. Do you agree with that? Have we been too focused on what we're against? And if so, what should America do to better emphasize what we're for?
Well, I do think, what we're for, we've been, pretty consistent across administrations with maybe, one or two exceptions, that we are, we're for a world in which people get to choose their own governments, representative democracy, where there's a free markets and fair trade, level playing field, where people who work hard can see opportunity and benefit from their own hard work. They're not weighted down by corruption or heavy-handed government and so forth. I mean, so I think our values, constitutional forms of government, freedom, democracy, opportunity. I mean, these are things that are in the American DNA. It's things that, for the most part, the world has associated with America for generations. And I think, one of our problems right now is we're not always living up to our own ideals. We're not always perceived as championing those ideals at home or abroad. So we have some work to do there. But one of the things I love about organizations like Spirit of America is, it's Americans showing up and having direct contact with people and making that direct personal impression, which usually is very positive and gives people hope that the ideal that they've always associated with America is actually the reality of it as well. So.
Yeah, and one of the things that's encouraging, with respect to the protests in China and Iran, what we see from a civil society standpoint in Ukraine and in Taiwan, is that we Americans are not alone in what we're standing for, and that others are our partners in those, and sometimes in those beliefs and values, and sometimes they just need a little help to get there. And to that end, that's what we're all about at Spirit of America, of course, and it's been an enormous boost to our efforts to have you as part of the team. And so we're also at time. So I want to thank you for that, Michelle, and thank you for joining us today. All the best to you and your family for very, very happy holidays.
You too, and thank you for all that you're doing and the way in which you're representing the best of the Spirit of America. So thanks.
Thank you. Bye now.